Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en esta última jornada, último día, tercer día de estas Trobades Camus. 3 días en las que hemos tratado de pensar juntos, de escuchar y de sentirnos juntos. 3 días construyendo a nuestra manera ese nosotros al que Camus nos invitaba cuando escribía Me revelo, luego somos. Hoy queremos retomar cómo Camus vivía, dándolo todo en el presente sin reservas. Y esta mañana por eso se compone de 4 tiempos. 2 mesas de pensamiento y 2 momentos de arte vivo, 4 maneras distintas de decir que la fraternidad no es un ideal abstracto, sino algo que se hace con el cuerpo, con las palabras, con la voz y con la presencia. Por eso comenzamos con una conversación que ya lleva varios años construyéndose entre Sandi y Alessandro, de Daar, un colectivo que trabaja en esa intersección entre el arte, la arquitectura y la política. Y su práctica nace de una pregunta también concreta y radical: ¿cómo se habita un espacio cuando ese espacio te ha sido negado? ¿Cómo se construye comunidad cuando las condiciones materiales lo hacen imposible? Lo que sin duda nos traen hoy es una exploración de la revuelta camusiana en su dimensión más colectiva. Bienvenidos, Sandi y Alessandro.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you to everyone that makes that possible. And actually, we were quite excited this 2 days of thinking, what does it mean for us to sort of be in conversation? Because normally we are invited to do a presentation together, and we take this challenge seriously. And we thought, why not to actually show only behind us our projects, because we do not want this really to be about presenting our projects. If you are interested about our project, you can simply go to our website. We have quite intense archive. And we will accompany you with some of these images, because maybe at the end, I was thinking I would like to begin about presenting who we are and how did we begin to work together and why did we begin to work together. So, I mean, I am Sandi Hilal. I was born and raised in Palestine, Bet Sahur. Bet Sahur is a small town south of Bethlehem that was actually well known for what was called the White Intifada during the first Intifada. And I definitely came from a situation, or was formed in a situation where I saw my community, my people, my father, mother, grandparents, sort of in a second when Israelis decided that it was so dangerous actually to have more than 4 Palestinians coming together, and they closed schools, universities, whatever would bring us together. And therefore you will understand what does it mean to be together for a colonial project. In that sense, only us deciding to be together and organize ourselves together was seen as a very, very dangerous act of resistance. And indeed, you know what I think I myself witnessed and be part of, is that they were so worried about schools being closed that everybody in the neighborhood came and says, how many teachers do we have in the neighborhood? How many students do we have? How many empty living rooms and garages we have? And I saw a community in only 2 days setting up a school. And that experience, being part of that experience and understanding what does it mean to decide, and what actually does it mean, I have to say, when we speak about self-determination. In Arabic, self-determination is حق تقرير المصير, and that means is your right to decide your becoming. And in that sense, for me, the most simple act of people from Beit Sahur bringing 18 cows to the city and deciding to produce our own milk, and Israelis decided to put us under curfew of 40 days because we decided to produce our own milk. And in that sense, they decided that these cows are very dangerous, and they began to follow them everywhere between living rooms. I mean, people hiding them in living rooms, in valleys, and actually witnessing that moment of simply asking to produce one own milk or to decide one own way of teaching the next generation. That is for me, when you hear Palestinians shouting for their right to self-determination, all what they are asking for is to be able to produce their own milk, to teach their own kids, and that is actually, I think, in our case, has maybe been one of the foundations of how we built our practice. And in that sense, I went to study in Italy. I studied architecture there. I met Alessandro, and then we proceed with our PhDs, and then decided to return back to Palestine when I was pregnant with our first daughter. I mean, we are both partners in life and in work, and we wanted to raise our daughters actually in an extended family. And so we decided to return back home. And again, like the school in the first Intifada, we thought, what do we have? We were two young PhDs, recently finished, and we didn't know from where to begin. And Europe felt so hard to begin from, because in that sense, all what we had in front of us is to be working either in a studio of architecture or to the maximum being assistant teachers for so long, for 20, 30 years, until eventually we will become teachers at universities. And we decided why not to go to Palestine. And actually we ourselves went there, and Palestinians normally built houses for their kids on top of their buildings. And my parents, because they thought that we will be living definitely in Europe, they only built one room and one living room for us on the roof of the house. So we had a huge terrace in front of our house. And we actually simply returned back there. We called ourselves Daar. We co-founded. We said, what are our resources? We have a terrace, big one, where we began. Weather in Palestine is amazing for 10 months a year. So we began to organize our own lectures, conversations. We called ourselves Daar. Daar means home in Arabic. My brother was not yet married, so we asked him to lend us his apartment, and we created a residency. So that is when you read Daar is decolonizing architecture, art, and residency. And that is why, because actually we decided to go to Palestine, so there was no way to avoid understanding what does it mean to decolonize, how our life would look like by living in Palestine and decolonizing our practice, understanding our practice in that sense. So decolonizing architecture, because we are architects and we felt it's very important to continue with that. Also because architecture is one of these ways in which words can create forms, right? And create spaces and create potentialities. Art, because architecture was so conservative discipline, and in somehow we had to work only with powers most of the time if we want to be architects. And the art was our way to be rebellion within architectural sort of sphere. So bringing art and architecture has been absolutely very important for us. And then residency, because hospitality has been always at the center of our practice. So what does it mean indeed for us to be able always to create communities around us? And we always thought that spaces are essential in order to understand how do we create communities. It's not enough. If we are in a space that the community have hard time to grow, it will not grow easily. So we decided we would like to host people and bring them in Daar in our practice. So this is a little bit who we are. And maybe, to continue the conversation with Alessandro in some way, I think I want to ask you what brought you to Palestine, and in some way how that affected who you are and our practice.
I also would like to start by maybe acknowledging, first of all, how, especially at this time, we can still keep maybe seeing images, if that is possible, because we are practitioners, so we tend to reflect on our practice. We are not theorizing from other people's work, but we are very much actually attached to our own practice, which is the possibility for us to understand and being in the world. Before answering to your questions, I also wanted to have a couple of acknowledgements. First is how difficult is to speak at this time, especially around what is happening in Palestine. And many times, we, every time there is an invitation, we have to think twice if how to do it, if to do it, if makes any sense to talk in a moment in which we feel, or at least I feel, that that we failed. We failed, to stop this killing machine. There were years in which maybe we had illusions that our work was tied to a bigger struggle. But in many days, we have the sense of having failed and how to deal with that defeat of, as we speak, we know that more families have been killed, not only in Palestine, in Lebanon. The ambition of Israel is now reaching beyond Palestine. And in that sense, many times we feel that the ground on which we felt we were standing on is shaking, or disappeared. So first, the acknowledgement of what you are going to try. Please see that as a way to attempt to continue to live in this world, to continue to understand what is happening, but also with this deep sense of having failed and being defeated. But nevertheless, we also recognize that maybe we are also part of also a longer trajectory of resistance, that, from 1936, during the Arab Revolt, the first Intifada, 1987, the Arab Spring, 2011, even the students' encampments of the last years. So these are also moments to acknowledge that many of us are not giving up and accepting the reality as it is, and we are still struggling to change. The second thing, maybe, I don't know if I want to answer to your questions, but the second thing I also wanted to say, that I wanted to take the invitation of Sandra to have a conversations in a way that what you see, these are some of also the images that we usually use during our lectures, but one of the things of the lectures that everything is planned, and in that case, we would like maybe also reflect on the days that we were with all of you and what we listened previously, and therefore maybe conversations among us, but most likely also a conversation also with all of you. And therefore taking the conversations maybe also as a way to produce knowledge, a way to also consider conversations maybe as important as could be, reading a book or watching a film or listening to prepared lectures. Also, maybe we will get a little bit distracted by those images, but I hope that as sometimes we are now able to do more one thing at the same time, the images also speaks about some of the projects that that we are reflecting on. And I want to get to maybe to the point of our conversations that seems to me relevant in relation to the idea of these gatherings, which is also trying to reflect on a theme and trying to reflect, as it has been for these invitations, on specific concepts. And that also is something that is very close to the ways in which we work, which means that for us, every interventions, every architectural or artistic project is also a way to redefine the concepts as we know them. Because the acknowledgement, the second acknowledgement I want to make is that we are using colonial languages, right? Being English, the ones that we use, which is not our native language. My native language is Italian, but that is also a colonial language. Spanish is also a colonial language. And every colonial language, of course, comes with the package. We like it or not. So we use those concepts. And I think we have to, first of all, recognize that, that this language is very far, or I would say it's inherent certain form of violence that somehow we have to acknowledge. Yesterday, for example, was briefly touched about that our own theme of the conversations, of course, it's complicated, and we have to try a way maybe to reframe those terms, and maybe also on one side criticizing them, on one side redefining them, but also trying to reflect on new vocabulary that we have to build. And this moment of conversations, maybe these are the moments in which we can open up our imagination to understand what are the new words that get a little bit closer to the experience that we feel in our bodies, to the experience that we feel in our everyday life, because many times these words looks like just inherited a little bit from the past. So come to the questions of what brought me in Palestine. I have maybe a very banal questions or answer, and I remember that. The answer is simple. It's love, because I met Sandi in Venice, and when I went for the first time in Palestine, I didn't know much about it, in the sense that I was neither an activist nor a religious person, and therefore maybe I didn't have a specific way of looking at Palestine, because that also, on my experience over decades and more, is also the possibility of seeing Palestine for what is very difficult, because it's so mediated and filtered by structures that is very difficult to realize what is there. So in this case, for me, it was much more a learning experience. I would say that personally, learning has been always, there are sometimes some blacks, that's fine to have them too, is the fact that reflecting on the Palestine as a way, and that coincides with my study in Venice. So we moved there, and then at that point, Palestine became what I used to say my real PhD on understanding how architecture is used for colonizations. Should I continue, or you wanna? I have more things to say.
Yalla, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I also like to improvise on those images. Those images are related to one of our projects that we engaged in 2008 when one of the Israeli military camps was evacuated very close to our house, and was for the first time in which we also saw what happened when these colonial buildings are evacuated, how people reuse them. And for us, that was an image of decolonization. because there was a lot of discussions about should we reuse the military base as it was, or could be reused in a kind of different ways. So the day in which we were there with also Imad, which is the director of the Palestine Wildlife Associations, and he was explaining us that Oshograb, that was the name of this military base, was actually an incredible space for migration of the birds. So, and one of the problems, of course, as you also saw in these days, that the expansion of colonization is continuing, and many of these military bases are simply then turned into new Israeli settlements. So in this case, for us, architecture was more about how we transform the military base into a nest for birds that migrates from Europe towards Palestine down to Africa. So our interventions in this case was an interventions of continuing destroying these buildings, not restoring them, continuing to make holes, and then the holes will be the place in which birds can actually nest. And that question of decolonization, I guess, has been following us since we were there. What does it mean to decolonize in Palestine could be simply maybe stated as getting rid of the Israeli occupations, colonization, and apartheid. But in the moment we moved to Europe, or back to Europe, because for me also was a returning back, these questions, of course, change its meanings. What does it mean to decolonize is not the same. Because, from Europe, of course, you can be in solidarity with Palestine, but also there is a specific work that needs to be done when you are here with the institutions, with the colonial institutions that we Europeans inherited, such as universities, museums, exhibition spaces, the White Cube, all of those things. They are essentially modernist colonial expressions of how, let's say, in architecture, how the space should be understood. And that is why also in this maybe constant movement that we continue to try to do between Palestine and Europe and other places in the Arab world specifically, is a way maybe for us to continue to find a different ground in which we can continue to operate. Because, as I said, not all the time, that is possible. I know at this moment, it became impossible for me to continue to live in Palestine. Despite we are married, we have kids. Every time that I would cross the border, I have, hours of interrogation that can last 8 days, and all the time, it's unsure if I would be allowed by the Israeli authorities to enter and come back to my house. So that is the conditions I lived for 10 years. A conditions that also was very important for me to realize the privilege that many Europeans have, and often they don't realize that you can just take a flight and go almost in every part of the world, and that is colonial heritage. That freedom of movement is based on a privilege because Europe colonized the entire world, and of course it's not true the other way around. And that is the kind of structure we live in, and that is a structure that we cannot normalize. And that is another lessons I've learned from refugee camps, but maybe that is another chapter.
Yes. No, I will departure from refugee camps in that sense, because, we return back to Palestine, and obviously, as architects that are interested in decolonization, the first thing you think where colonization really stands are Israeli colonies in the West Bank, right? So we, like Oshograb, the ones that Alessandro showed, we also take different examples of settlements, and we thought how, as architects, we will turn that against itself. What does it mean, indeed, to take an Israeli settlement that is on the top of a hill, and instead of being there in order to separate Palestinians, in order to separate territories, how if that would become the public space that would actually bring all of us together? And in there, indeed, beginning to work there, we began to be so suspicious on how we studied public spaces in faculties of architecture in Europe, because you arrive there, and as an architect, your aspiration is to design a public space, because that is the good, that is the right way, ethical way to do it. If I am designing a public, then I'm good enough. If I'm designing the house of my grandmother, maybe, I am a little bit compromised as an architect. So it's aspiration of all of us. Indeed, in faculties of architecture, normally they ask you to design a square, to design a museum. These are the things where we are very proud of as architects. But arriving to Palestine and beginning indeed to work on Israeli settlements, the first thing you realize that, Palestinians had so different ways of being in collective beyond the public, and in that sense, beyond the institutional public, the state, right? So we have forms of masha', and the masha' is a way in which we operate in collectivity, like Palestinian farmers would come together and would plant faraway lands from the villages by collectively working around it. And you have that land for that year, and it's constantly changing, so you don't get addicted to that particular land. They change it constantly as a way of working collectively together. And the moment that you are not anymore active in the masha' is not anymore yours. It returns back to the public. So what Israel did, and that is where we have to be very aware of what does public means. Israel arrives to any kind of, there is masha', waqf, and many other collective forms. They came, and as very good urban planners, they design all these forms of collectivity. They call it public, and in the name of public, Palestinians has been expropriated of all way of collectively being together. So it's not that if we design a public, then we are absolutely sort of good people. We have to ask, what is the public we are designing exactly? Who are in use with that public? And actually only think about it this way. The public in Europe especially doesn't need someone, it doesn't need people. It works alone. The masha' would never work without people activating it. So what does it mean, indeed, having public that works without necessarily people in it? Actually, in the contrary, sometimes if people are opposing who is hosting that public, means we want to do protests that we do not like that public, we are completely shut down. It's the public, and there is that rhetoric, that heavy rhetoric, I guess, in Europe of the public is for everyone, the public is where diversity meets, the public is where diversity would encounter each other. And maybe in there, I would really like to bring one very important example for me that stayed with me for 8 years. So, when we returned back, I began to work in UNRWA, and I worked there for 8 years, and I was a technocrat. So in that sense, heading a department in the UN, which is UNRWA is the UN that provides services for Palestinian refugees. And in that sense, having worked so my morning until 2:30 will be as a technocrat in UNRWA. I also became to be part of the senior management, which means also ability of sort of deciding and taking a decision on refugee camps. And my afternoons were all around Daar and what does it mean to decolonize. So that sort of form of being in two places simultaneously helps me understand my being inside UNRWA in a completely different manner. And one of the things, of course, I also came out from maybe studying in Europe, in Italy particularly, is like, why don't we have squares like the Italian squares? It's like we are very active in the streets, but we do not have squares, right? And at a certain point, I would arrive in this camp south of the West Bank. And I decide why don't, and especially because few women encourage me there. You know, we were there asking people, what would you like? And few women ask for a square inside one of the camps that is actually quite conservative. So the question raised is like, what does it mean indeed to have a square inside a refugee camp that has no state? So the question, who manage a collective square, became extremely important, and it didn't occur to me, actually. That was also another moment of hitting of who is hosting in the public and who is responsible for the public. And at a sudden, you know, they decided in the camp to raise walls around that square and have 4 doors and 4 walls, and it turned to be a roofless square. And I was shocked as an architect, and it took me a while to process, and they were really very kind with me to teach me one, maybe, and if not the most important lesson of my life as an architect, is how do you think we manage that place if it is an abstract place? You know, we don't have a municipality. So in that sense, they gave me few examples of, imagine there are a group of women that are coming together, they take that square, they occupy that square in this moment, and they want to have their own privacy, sing together, laugh there, make their party. Maybe you saw also a few of these images. And in that sense, it's immediately in front of that door when people would see that party going on and they are not invited to that party, they just simply leave. Or kids are playing in the square and they are playing football and a pregnant woman would pass by. If she's passing by the alleys, the way I always imagined, and a football would hit her, because they told me, look, we are the one doing our own juries in this. So if anything happened, we are responsible for our streets, we are responsible for our sort of alleys. So we have to sit and say, who is responsible for what? If people will happen by chance, there is no way we can manage that as a community. They told me we need threshold. Threshold is extremely important in order for a community to actually self-organize. If you are a state, you don't need a threshold because you are God managing these people, so you don't need that threshold. But if you are people managing a space together, you need thresholds in order to understand who is the host and who is the guest in that sense. There is not only one monotheistic big host. If we are a community and we deal with each other, hosts is changing all the time, and hosts needs to take responsibility of that, taking care of that place. And for me, actually, maybe that is, if I have to be brutal, that is one of the most important lessons I learned in refugee camp that I brought with me back to Europe and has been my way of processing a returned life in Europe. But maybe I would pass it to Alessandro and then come back to how I returned back to Europe with that particular sort of knowledge from refugee camps.
Here I just like maybe to use my head as a sort of teacher. And since I was proposing just to reflect on the words that we use, so I would like to come back to some of the words that also Sandi used and to see if they resonate, with you or not. And she was describing Al-Masha, that historically was a common land that was shared among farmers, in which the farmers would decide how to cultivate the land. And for us, it was very inspiring to look the use of Al-Masha, but I would say the use of common land in Palestine before the Israeli colonization. There were several forms of being common without the state. So one thing that, for example, I have been educated in Western universities, that if you want to understand the city, the basic structure is public and private spaces, right? This is a public space, you go to your house, and this is a private space, right? Now, if you are in a refugee camp, this category actually doesn't make any sense whatsoever, because in a refugee camp, you don't have a municipality. You do have streets, but it's not, the lighting on the streets is not put on by a municipality. So there is no sense of a public entity that actually could take care of the space that they are in common. Similarly, even the private home, despite everyone knows who built that house and who put the money and the labor in the house, but since there is a refugee camp, by law, you are not allowed to own a private title on the house that you actually built, because refugee camps, just to remember to everyone, were built just to be a temporary situation, right? Therefore, when you are in a refugee camp, suddenly, all the knowledge that the Western, in my case, the Western study that I had as urban planner, it didn't make any sense. It actually prevented me to understand, how life is organized, where suddenly the notion of the public and the private space doesn't help you to understand how that is done. And one of the concepts that, in a way, was for us important to use was the concept of al-masha, was the concept that you are able to understand how the common is produced when people decide together to produce something into common. And it is very different from the public. Now, we are so much used to understand, this dichotomy, and that is modernity, unfortunately, that it's very difficult to understand that between the private and the public space, there are so many other forms in which people can live that are not necessarily trapped into the private and the public. That also shows, how modernity brought this kind of homogenization of life, dividing completely these two realms, separated, even though our life is constantly in need of transgression of that sort of separations. Now, in Palestine, since there is no state, there is a colonial power, and there are refugee camps, in a way, you are able to see what does it mean to organize life and how life is produced when people decide, for example, to organize their life in a refugee camp. So one of the, let's say, being conversation with you would also mean think about how every day you are transgressing this private and public spaces and being able maybe to produce something that somehow is not under the jurisdiction of the public and not under the jurisdiction of the private. And that is one of the tasks that's been now since a couple of decades for us to reopen, the possibility to imagine communality that is not supervised by neither the public and nor the private. So that is definitely one term that we would like to propose. The second, we briefly mentioned the refugee camp, and that may be similar to Fraternidad, that needs maybe to be redefined. Because if I say refugee camps, most of you think about refugee camp as something that people put up as a tent, as a shelters, But if you visit Palestinian refugee camps that were built in 1948, they don't look anymore simply as made of tents. And of course, they also call for a different redefinition of what is a refugee camp, when you still have a colonial power that is constantly, of course, producing a history of displacement. And another concept that becomes very important for us to understand, this specific dimensions of refugee camps is the idea of permanent temporariness. So what does it mean when a temporary conditions, like the Israeli occupations, because by law should supposed to be over, is perpetuated for so long time And when the right of return of the Palestinians, that's something inscribed in international law, has been also postponed for so many years. So you live in this sort of suspensions of everything, so that you, of course, and it's designed politically to be like this. And the refugee camps, if you like, is the spatial architectural manifestations of a political crisis, when you don't know anymore how to deal with the possibility of including someone in a community. The solutions, the political, legal, and spatial solution is suspensions, is to enforce people to live in this suspended state, waiting one day for things to be resolved. And that is so dramatic. You can imagine that when that condition is so prolonged, here we don't have the time, of course, to also recount the fundamental history that since the Nakba in 1948 and the continuation of the Nakba, because we haven't imagined, and these are the moments which I feel that I lost my ground, because when we were talking about refugee camps, we were seeing them in this historical trajectory, how we get out of it. And now, with a recent escalation into a genocide, of course, also our own understanding of that history somehow get completely smashed, because what does it mean then to add into that dramatic history since 1948 until today, something that it could maybe historically be remembered even something worse than the Nakba itself, where Palestinians were expelled from the historical Palestine. And these are the moments which I have to say I lose a little bit myself. So maybe, should I make you a question?
No, I want to continue. I want to speak about my return to Europe. Maybe that would be your question,
Okay.
right? I mean, I don't want
but this
to
doesn't
finish.
work like this, then.
No, it doesn't work like that. I don't want, because
think
mindful about
question.
time, right? We have to begin wrapping up, right? So I would absolutely love to bring you in how I return back to Europe, because for me that is extremely important, also to share certain frustrations. We have been so nice so far, but I think that some fractions is needed at the end of the conversation. And indeed, I don't know. I mean, I personally had different parts of my life trajectory. So first, I was in Palestine until I was 17 years old, and I also had both the experience of being under colonialism, but also of fighting colonialism, of resisting colonialism, of a non-violent first intifada where we gather, we organize ourselves, etc., etc. And then I went to study in Europe, in Italy particularly, and I was really faced of a generation that has so little to do with what I thought we should be fighting for. I realized that my peers in Italy were smashing the family as a very conservative, oppressive structure, smashing the state, smashing so many things. And it was all about destruction, right? And I was coming from a place that actually it feels so strange to talk about it in this historical moment. But during the first intifada, we were hopeful that, a possible world for us there was that possibility, right? So in some way, I left Palestine in that sense, went to Italy, studied modern architecture, and I would be sad if we do not speak about how modernity and colonialism are hand to hand in order, when they came to colonial destinations, when they came to Palestine, they didn't tell us we are coming to steal your land. They come to us with this promise of modern civilization, right? We are coming to civilize you. We are coming to modernize you. And actually, I have to say, I myself also a little bit collapsed into, I'm going to study modern architecture, so I return back to modernize Palestine, right? So, and in that sense, I will come back to be enabling an idea of knowledge colonization in Palestine, right? So it's very important. And I will come very closely to why I think it's very important to question certain aspects dark side of modernity, because there is a dark side of modernity that is not progress towards gender equality, towards progress for rights, etc., etc. There is a very, very dark part of modernity that was the main assistant. I always say that it was the good wife of the bad colonizer, right? That comes with the promise of civilization, of modernization. I mean, to make a very long story short, when I arrived to Italy, I accepted myself as a student migrant, right? And I accepted to begin from a tabula rasa. So all the knowledge that I was carrying valued nothing. I had to make a race to run and learn all the knowledge that comes from the West, because that is the knowledge. That is the knowledge that would civilize you. That is the knowledge that will bring you in. And I have to say, I arrived to a point where, you know, when you eat a lot of something, you develop an allergy, right? And I'm very, very, very allergic to the word inclusion. When somebody says we would like to include you, I mean, my face becomes so red, and I'm unable to keep my temper down. Just, you know, including me. Why? Who gave you that pretentious idea that you need to include? I mean, what does including someone? Why do you think you can be the main host forever? And here maybe I want to very quickly jump into returning back. When I had to return back to Europe, I knew that I did not want to be included, because I am allergic, you know. So when you are allergic to something and you return back to a place, and, you know, I am a great joker in the cards. You know, wherever you put me, I works. You know, I mean, black hair, Palestinian woman, I speak okay. So I worked, I'm a joker. You can put me wherever you want and you go well. And I was just like, what does that mean for me? Always being included and always accepted to be part of that. And I didn't want to return back as a migrant. You know, after we returned back to Palestine, 10 years of building in dignity, being myself, being at the center of my life, producing my knowledge, together actually, but producing also a knowledge where I felt I am belonging to, I was not ready to return back to Europe, because I knew that there is nothing waiting for me in Europe but to be included. So at the beginning, I really opposed very strongly, and my father was just like, you know, why aren't you happy to go to the most welfare state of the world? You know, Sweden is considered one of the happiest places on earth. And, you know, I didn't have words. I didn't understand why I was not happy to return back to Sweden, or to return back to Europe, I have to say. I didn't know what Sweden is. So in that sense, I returned back very, very skeptical. And definitely, I returned back with a promise to myself that I will never accept to be included. Either I can include and be included, but to be only one way included, I am beyond that. You know, when you are a student, you can share homes with other students. There are certain things that you accept to do. I was beyond being included in Europe. So I arrived and says, okay, what is my task? What I can do? What is a possibility for me? And a lot of time I return back to Arabic for me, it's a very important sometimes way of refuging. And there is a part of the Islamic hadith that I think is really extremely important, speaking about hospitality, and says, الضيافة ثلاثة أيام وما بعد فصدقة. Means in English, hospitality is for 3 days, and after that, it becomes charity. So my question to myself is like, what will happen with me the 4th day I arrive to Sweden, right? I accept to be respected guest for the first 3 days. And that brought me to how hospitality in the Arab world is perceived as a temporary practice. It's 3 days practice. And after that, you know, it's like Christmas. You can be very kind with everyone for 3 days. And then you have you have to go beyond that. There is no way that you continue in the same kindness, right? It's the same with hospitality. What I found problematic, and especially within a Western philosophy, bringing people like Derrida and others, they actually, by proposing the unconditional hospitality, they accepted, or they unconsciously, with a colonial mind, moved hospitality from being a temporary 3 days practice into unconditional hospitality. But the host will remain the host, knowing that, being colonial host, you cannot really be host forever. So let's make it unconditional. And I think for me, the real then struggle coming back to Europe, I began to work on a project where it was about demanding our right to be hosts and not be eternal guests. Because when they ask you to behave, if they are coming to our societies, they have to behave and become one of us. I tell you, this project of the EU is a very, very disturbing project, because that means that what is proposed is only assimilation. And I would be one of these people in Italy that would win a prize of integration, right? But I never became Italian. So I would be one of these examples that ticks all the points, married an Italian man, still in love after 25 years of marriage, have 2 amazing daughters. I miss Italy much more than how Alessandro miss Italy. I like the place where he comes from much more than how much he likes him, but I have never become Italian. So that promise of, if you behave, you become one of us, is a promise that the EU did not actually respect me in that. And I decided I will never come back with the same contract. If I am here, I pretend my right to host 3 days after I arrive. That means actually creating spaces for migrants to host. And guess what? And I will finish with that. We created a space in the north of Sweden that considers itself one of the most democratic societies in Europe. After 3 years, refugees began to host so strongly, so they began to invite politicians, they began to ask the mayor, we come to your office, of course we come to your office and we are very happy to be your guests, but you have to come also to us, and we would like to have you as guest in your own sort of place, right? And that became a very active place in the north of Sweden, because, many migrants then, when they arrive, they began also to speak the language of our right to be host. We don't want only to be guests. 3 years after, this project has been commissioned by a state public art agency, which is a state agency. The migration office decided to close it without giving any explanation. And I asked, as an artist, at least to have one only time of discussion with the people that decided to close the place, because I was very curious on why I needed to build my story, right, of why that has been closed. They closed it. It was closed by a state agency. And guess what? Moderna Mosette decided to acquire it and preserve it. So that project has been commissioned by a state, closed by a state without even saying why they are closing it, and preserved by a state. And that shows actually the complexity of willing from one side to see people acting, to see migrants like us, people that comes from a diverse sort of grounds coming in, yet not act to the point to become strong enough to question certain things, right? To be really part of building that society. And for me, what really happened, and I will end by that, refugees and migrants that found themselves in the extreme north of Europe were able to act upon their right to be host. Yet, Swedish democratic migration officers were unable to see themselves as guests and were unable to give with this idea of them being the saviors of the world, which is a very, very colonial heritage that needs to be taken into consideration. So if you will find yourself only hosting, please question your colonial heritage. If you are unable to accept the guests after the third day of arriving to Spain, if they would like to build their vocabulary, discuss their vocabulary, create thresholds where you will be hosted and being hosted by. That is for me where the colonial heritage of Europe needs to be questioned. And thank you very much.
And should we have a little bit of lights on? And if we take some questions, if you have time, yes, if there are any.
Thank you, Sandi and Alessandro. I will use this colonial language. And apologies, because as you mentioned, Spanish is also a colonial language, and maybe even more for Menorcans. So I just wanted to ask, in this idea of being you raise such a wide array of terminology that I think is super important when analyzing Palestine and how to think of this sort of like post-genocide, if we see an end to it, hopefully soon. But how to reimagine that space, reimagine, let's say, a Gaza or a West Bank after genocide. You have given us a series of examples of how the public space is considered or has been conceived by the communities in Palestine, this idea of al-Masha', but also how would you, I don't know how to frame this, but the question, how would you reimagine that space with all the trauma that has befallen upon the Palestinians? That is, all the people who have now lost their limbs, all the, let's say, orphans. How does that affect the would-be public space? The fact that the actual social fabric has been torn by the extremely brutal occupation. I don't know if you can have a thought about that.
Well, let me try to, that is, I think, one of the hardest questions that we can ask. And I have to say that I'm not sure we will be able, there is no way to not to carry that heritage of such trauma. The question is definitely how do you deal with that, and also mainly how you will not continue destruction. Because being architects, we understand that reconstruction Gaza, without taking into consideration all the ties between the public and the private in the space, what is already been produced while they are there, because they are not standing. And to reconstruct Gaza from up down is about continuing with architecture to destruct Gaza. And Palestine, actually, I have to say, we are speaking about all Palestine in that sense. So what does it mean if you want, sometimes having purpose in in life after a genocide helps a lot, because I see a lot of people that are able on individual levels to actually, even if they have passed so harsh time, on individual level, to still be finding themselves if they would find a purpose, right? And my hope, my wishful thinking in that sense as Palestinian is to understand how we are guiding even the rest of the world to understand what does it mean to build a society that is built in between the private and the public, that is not controlled only by a public governance, and that is not only controlled by capitalism, but in that sense controlled by a way of being together in the world in a different way. And let me give you one very quick example. As an architect, I really refuse. My grandmother worked 20 years in order to buy a tiny piece of land, 500 meters square of land in Beit Sahur, where she built on top. She began to build, and then my uncles, and then my cousins, and then, so that place for me is my belonging to Palestine. And I'm among the luckiest that actually are still living in the place where my grandmother sort of rooted us. And I really refuse hardly to call this private property, as someone in Minorca or in New York would buy 10 apartments that have never visited, right? So what does it mean when we think about private and public? We consider what my grandmother did, how we return back to heritage of Palestine, where many grandparents, parents, and kids are still figuring out how to rebuild that. If we will accept a top-down building in that sense, the way that many are proposing without even being part of whatever is happening, considering the rebels, only rebels to be thrown in the water, I think we will absolutely, which is very high risk that is happening, we will continue destructing Gaza and Palestine. And I'm afraid that if we will not immediately oppose it and resist against it, I am afraid that it will take us to a place of no return.
Thank you. Now, thank you for your enlightening conversation. At the beginning of this year, at my university, we invited a Palestinian writer, Mah Kayal, to give the inaugural talk, which he gave online. And when he was asked what was the most important thing for him, for his writing, he said, to use literature as an instrument of liberation. And then he added, and for me, liberation from imperialism, from colonialism, would imply not asking Palestinian writers to always be representing the Palestinian plight and writing for international audience about what the suffering of Palestinians is. Because, no, for me, liberation, he said, was to write for my people, to write, and I don't need to tell them what they're going through. This for me was a very important lesson, because he was saying, I'm getting invited to festivals, universities to talk about this, and I'll always expect it to be a representative. No? And you, Sandi, presented this complicated paradox of how to avoid being always in the role of the guest in front of the host. And I think there's this other paradox, the sort of condemnation or fate, in which, on the one hand, one has to bear witness, of what is happening, and it is important to bear witness about what is happening, but at the same time, that it displaces the position, because the dialogue is always with this other former colonial powers or present colonial powers. It is a dialogue with the center of imperialism to make this center aware, no, of what is happening elsewhere because they don't want to look. So how can one come out of this difficult bind, no, of at the same time think in terms of freedom of an experience and use art, literature, whatever, in dialogue with other forms of human existence that is not just talking, this constantly in the same role. I was wondering.
Maybe I want to still be adding one part for me that I have to say. I was extremely lucky to be working with Alessandro in that sense, and because when you working with him, coming from a Western knowledge on base of love, because sometimes we really underestimate what love might bring on the table, right? So it's extremely very important to deal with that, and I think it's one part that was impossible for me when I arrived to Europe, and especially because Palestine is under threat of erasures. So we become very resistant towards anything that can criticize Palestine, right? I mean, self-criticism for us is a double hard practice, because we have first to actually make sure that the space stays. And in the same time, what for me, the real risk of what we are passing in this moment as Palestinians is that we have no space for self-criticism. And there is no way that you can go for self-determination without it being accompanied by self-criticism. And that is where I see the task of as many intellectuals in the world that can come together, but they should be coming with this humbleness of not teaching. My problem with Europe is that, they feel that their real task is to teach others, rather than, and that is where I feel that it's oppressive to be host forever, right? I mean, because it feels like this is what I know how to do, and it's so hard for me just to lose my words because I am in a place where I should be simply guest. I don't have to teach the rest of the world how they have to save the planet, how they have to, name it all. I don't want to name how many things in European institutions is still wanting to teach, right? So I think if we will come together, because we do need, for me it was extremely important to be able not to be afraid to question, for example, what is the right of return today for Palestinians without including the refugee camp and the history of the refugee camp in the middle. And I would have never gone there alone. To touch upon, in a self-critical way, to touch upon the right of return in Palestine is pornography, is a taboo. There is no way you can do that. Even though we sold it, that right of return, yet if you open your mouth and speak about it, it is a problematic, right? It's highly, so I think if we come together, accepting that we move constantly between being guest and host. Indeed, I am a believer that a real democracy is possible only if people are moving constantly between being guests and hosts. If we keep the binaries of being only hosts, of being only guests means also accepting your situation as an oppressed, and that you have to convince your host that he has to give you charity as many days as possible, as many months as possible, and many years as possible. And then you will arrive to a point that you lose your dignity. I mean, definitely you lose your dignity. So what does it mean today, departing from Palestine and actually understanding that the system of nation states, we have been, I don't know how many of you are aware of what is happening in Venice Biennial in this moment. I mean, it's collapsing because it only depends on understanding the world through a colonial nation state sort of gaze, and that is not working, right? So in which way I think and to use the word, you know, in which way we come together. I love the word عزوة in Arabic rather than, you know, the word عزوة in Arabic comes from Daar. And you might have 10 brothers, but there is only one brother that is your عزوة, not all of them. Because you know that in a moment of difficulty, that person, man or woman or other figures, will be there for you. And there is no need to speak about it, right? So the عزوة is a way in which you understand that you're there for me when I need you, and that sometimes you're the strong and sometimes I am the strong. And sometimes you're the weak and sometimes I am the weak. But we know, we already told each other that we will be dears for each other. We will be there in that sense. And when we actually found ourselves going to Cairo because we wanted to be nearby Gaza, we asked ourselves who we are. What is it that we are doing? And actually, I really needed to feel the Palestinian عزوة going in Cairo, going nearby Gaza. What does it mean actually, instead of I want to help you, sustain you, this and I mean, we're strong, guys. We're very, very, very strong. We have built such a history that will be haunting us forever, and you will be finding more and more strong Palestinians sitting on the stage, speaking and talking. And it's time to think that why don't we learn from each other? And in order to learn from each other, you have to unlearn so many things. The task of unlearning is so heavy in Europe. So I think earlier you begin to unlearn, better is for the rest of the world.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias a los dos por empezar a aprender a desaprender y haber conseguido descentrarnos, que yo creo que era lo fundamental. Así que muchísimas gracias por haber estado con nosotros y sentiros no solo invitados ni mucho menos, sino parte de eso y que nosotros hayamos estado del otro lado. Gracias a los dos.
Yes.